Having considered the overwhelming evidence and the extreme depravity of your actions, this court must impose a sentence that reflects the gravity of the harm you have caused. Therefore, on all counts, you are sentenced to a total term of 200 years.
Ashley Callison shot and killed her sister-in-law, Sophia Mitchell, and her two nephews, 5-year-old Liam and 3-year-old Noah, in their suburban home. Each victim was shot in the head, with little Noah still wearing his favorite superhero costume when his life was taken. The murders occurred in the middle of a sunny Monday afternoon in a quiet, well-established neighborhood where the Mitchell family had lived for 3 years after David Mitchell, Ashley's older brother, had received a promotion at the prestigious financial firm where he worked. What should have been an ordinary day became the setting for a senseless tragedy that would devastate a family and shock the tight-knit Charleston community. If you're enjoying this true crime analysis, please subscribe to our channel and let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. Your support allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light, examining the complex circumstances and seeking understanding where there often seems to be none. The timeline of events on that fateful day would become crucial to understanding the horrific crime that took place behind the Mitchell family's tasteful brick facade. David Mitchell had left for work early that morning, kissing his wife and sons goodbye before heading to his downtown office, completely unaware that it would be the last time he would see them alive. Sophia had spent the morning taking Liam to preschool and then running errands with Noah, returning home around noon to prepare lunch and get ready for Liam's return on the afternoon school bus. Text messages recovered from Sophia's phone showed a normal day of communication between the couple, with Sophia sending sweet updates about the boys' activities and making plans for dinner that evening. According to records later presented in court, Ashley Callison arrived at her brother's home at approximately 2:15 p.m., just after Liam had returned from preschool. Home security footage from a neighbor's camera captured Ashley's distinctive red hatchback pulling into the driveway, though the Mitchell home itself did not have external security cameras installed. Sophia had welcomed her young sister-in-law into their home many times before, as Ashley occasionally helped with the children or simply visited her nephews, to whom she had previously appeared to be a doting aunt. There had never been any reported conflicts between Ashley and Sophia, making the events that followed all the more incomprehensible to those who knew the family. At 2:43 p.m., Sophia sent a series of short video clips to her husband's phone, showing the boys playing and laughing in the living room. The videos captured Noah wearing his favorite Captain America costume that he often refused to take off, and Liam building an elaborate tower with his building blocks. These videos would later become crucial evidence, not only establishing the last moments of the victims' lives, but also confirming that just 4 minutes later, all three would be dead. The timestamp on these videos would create a precise timeline that would contradict Ashley's subsequent account of events and ultimately help lead investigators to the truth about what had happened inside the Mitchell home. The exact details of what transpired in those critical 4 minutes between the final video and the murders remained somewhat unclear, as the only surviving witness was the perpetrator herself. Forensic evidence later suggested that the first victim was Sophia, who was shot once in the back of the head while sitting on the living room sofa, likely watching her sons play. The bullet trajectory indicated she never saw it coming, never had a chance to defend herself or protect her children from what was about to happen. Blood spatter analysis showed that after shooting Sophia, the killer then turned the weapon on 5-year-old Liam, who appeared to have been shot while attempting to run toward the hallway, perhaps in fear after seeing what had happened to his mother. Little Noah, still in his Captain America costume, was the final victim, shot while hiding behind an armchair in the corner of the room. The medical examiner would later testify that the position of his body suggested He had tried to make himself small, to hide from the danger in the way that young children often instinctively do. The murder weapon, a 9mm handgun, later determined to belong to David Mitchell, who had a permit and kept it locked in a safe, was found on the coffee table. The gun safe in the master bedroom had been opened using the combination, suggesting that whoever had accessed it knew the code, a detail that would become significant as the investigation progressed. At 3:17 p.m., approximately 30 minutes after the estimated time of the shootings, Ashley Callison called her brother David. According to David's later testimony, Ashley's voice sounded panicked as she told him that she had gone to visit Sophia and the boys, but had heard a loud noise and a man's voice shouting when she approached the house. Ashley claimed she had cautiously entered through the unlocked back door, calling out for Sophia, only to discover the 3 bodies in the living room. She told her brother she had immediately run from the house in terror and was calling him from her car parked down the street. David Mitchell, in a state of shock and disbelief, immediately called 911 while simultaneously trying to reach his wife's phone. The recording of his 911 call captured his escalating panic as the reality began to sink in. "My sister just called. She says my wife and kids are hurt. There was an intruder," he told the dispatcher, his voice breaking. "I'm heading home now, but please send someone right away." In a tragic detail later revealed during the trial, phone records showed that David had tried calling Sophia's phone 7 times in the 4 minutes between receiving Ashley's call and reaching the emergency dispatcher, desperately hoping that there had been some mistake. Charleston police officers arrived at the Mitchell home at 3:28 p.m., 11 minutes after the 911 call was placed. They found the front door locked but the back door unlocked, just as Ashley had described. Upon entering, they immediately discovered the horrific scene in the living room: Sophia and her 2 young sons, all fatally shot in the head. The responding officers secured the scene and called for detectives and crime scene investigators, while other officers were dispatched to locate Ashley Callison, who had allegedly witnessed the aftermath of the crime. The first officers on the scene noted that despite Ashley's story of an intruder, there were no signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle, and nothing appeared to be stolen from the home. David Mitchell arrived home just as the first police cars were pulling up, having left his downtown office the moment he finished the 911 call. Body camera footage from the officers present captured his devastating reaction as he was prevented from entering the home, and gradually came to understand the full horror of what had happened to his family. His agonized cries echoed through the normally quiet neighborhood, drawing concerned neighbors from their homes to witness the unfolding tragedy. One neighbor, retired nurse Margaret Thompson, rushed to David's side and stayed with him, providing what comfort she could as his world collapsed around him. Sophia Mitchell was 32 years old when her life was cut short, a devoted mother and wife who had built a beautiful life centered around her family in their Charleston home. Born Sophia Reynolds in Savannah, Georgia, she had met David Mitchell during their college years at the University of Georgia, where she had studied early childhood education, and he had pursued finance. Their college friends described them as a perfect match from the start, both ambitious yet family-oriented, sharing similar values and dreams for their future. After graduation, they had married in a charming ceremony at a historic Savannah church, surrounded by family and friends who believed they were witnessing the beginning of a long and happy life together. Sophia had worked as a kindergarten teacher for several years before deciding to stay home after the birth of their first son, Liam. Her former colleagues at Charleston Elementary described her as a natural with children, patient and creative, with an ability to connect with even the most challenging students. When Noah was born 2 years after Liam, Sophia embraced life as a mother of 2 with characteristic grace and enthusiasm, creating a warm and loving home where her boys could thrive. Social media posts and family photos painted a picture of a woman who found genuine joy in motherhood, baking cookies with flower-covered children, creating elaborate birthday celebrations, and documenting the small, everyday moments that make up a family's life together. In the months before her death, Sophia had been planning to return to teaching part-time once Noah started preschool the following fall. She had maintained her teaching license and had been in discussions with her former principal about a possible position that would allow her to balance her professional passion with her commitment to being present for her young sons. Friends said she had been excited about this new chapter, eager to return to the classroom while still prioritizing her family. David had been supportive of her plans, proud of her accomplishments as both a mother and an educator, and looking forward to seeing her pursue her career again, while he continued his rise through the ranks at the financial firm where he had recently been promoted. The Mitchell family home reflected Sophia's warmth and attention to detail, a tasteful blend of traditional Charleston style with child-friendly practicality. Neighbors would later tell reporters that Sophia could often be seen in the front yard playing with the boys, creating elaborate chalk drawings on the sidewalk, or teaching them to ride bikes on the quiet street. She was known for organizing neighborhood gatherings, holiday cookie exchanges, and summer barbecues that brought together families from throughout their close-knit community. These same neighbors would later line the streets with candles and flowers in the days following the murders, a testament to the impact Sophia had made in the relatively short time the family had lived in the area. Liam Mitchell, at 5 years old, was just beginning to develop his own distinct personality, a thoughtful, curious kindergartner who loved building blocks, dinosaurs, and being a big brother. His kindergarten teacher would later describe him as bright and inquisitive, often asking questions that showed a level of thinking beyond his years. He had recently learned to read simple words and would proudly demonstrate this skill to anyone who would listen, carrying his favorite books everywhere. Liam was protective of his younger brother, though, like many siblings, they had their moments of rivalry and disagreement. In the video Sophia sent to David on the day of the murders, Liam could be seen helping Noah arrange action figures, demonstrating the kind brotherly affection that made their parents proud. 3-year-old Noah Mitchell was, by all accounts, an energetic and affectionate little boy who idolized his older brother and loved superheroes with a passion typical of many children his age. His preschool teachers described him as a little sunshine who greeted everyone with enthusiastic hugs and had a contagious laugh that could brighten the darkest day. Noah's love of costumes was well known among family and friends, with his Captain America outfit being a particular favorite that he often refused to take off, even for bedtime. In a heartbreaking detail that emerged during the investigation, Noah was still wearing this beloved costume when he was killed, a poignant reminder of the innocent childhood joy that was so brutally extinguished. The lives of Sophia, Liam, and Noah Mitchell were intertwined with the daily rhythms of family life in their Charleston community: school drop-offs and pickups, playground visits, story time at the local library, and Sunday dinners with extended family. David Mitchell, in his victim impact statement, later delivered at trial, would speak of the ordinary moments he missed the most: bedtime stories and goodnight kisses, Saturday morning pancakes, the sound of little feet running down the hallway. These simple routines, often taken for granted in the business of daily life, had formed the foundation of the Mitchells' happiness together, a happiness that was shattered in mere minutes on that March afternoon. In the aftermath of the murders, the extended Mitchell family struggled to comprehend not only the devastating loss, but the incomprehensible fact that the perpetrator was one of their own. David's parents, George and Elizabeth Mitchell, lost not only their daughter-in-law and grandsons, but also, in a very real sense, their daughter, as Ashley's actions placed her beyond the reach of normal family relationships. Sophia's parents, Robert and Catherine Reynolds, who lived in Savannah, had to face the unimaginable grief of burying their daughter and grandsons while trying to support their devastated son-in-law. The funeral service, held at the historic St. Michael's Church in downtown Charleston, drew hundreds of mourners from across the community, a testament to the impact the Mitchell family had made. Among those mourning were the many children and parents from Liam's kindergarten class and Noah's preschool, communities that were deeply affected by the sudden loss of the two young boys and their mother. School counselors worked with the children to help them process their grief, while parents struggled to explain the inexplicable to their young ones. One of Liam's classmates had asked her mother, "Why would someone hurt Liam? He was always nice to everyone." It was a question that echoed the one being asked throughout Charleston and beyond as news of the tragedy spread. Why would anyone, much less a family member, commit such a senseless act of violence against a loving mother and her innocent children? David Mitchell, having lost his entire immediate family in a single devastating event, faced the additional horror of knowing that his own sister was responsible. Friends described him in the days and weeks after the murders as a man moving through life in a state of shock, going through the necessary motions of funeral arrangements, legal meetings, and house decisions, while seemingly unable to fully process the magnitude of what had happened. "It was like watching someone underwater," said James Parker, David's longtime friend and colleague, who took leave from work to support him in the immediate aftermath. He was there physically, but some essential part of him was just gone. David would later move out of the family home, unable to return to the space where his family had been murdered, and would eventually relocate to a different part of Charleston to try to rebuild some semblance of a life. In a gesture that spoke to the character of both David and Sophia Mitchell, David established a memorial scholarship fund in Sophia's name at Charleston Elementary School, where she had once hoped to return to teaching. The scholarship would provide educational support to children from disadvantaged backgrounds, reflecting Sophia's belief that every child deserved access to quality education and nurturing guidance. In the years following the tragedy, this scholarship would become an important part of Sophia's legacy, a way of ensuring that her passion for teaching and her love for children would continue to make a positive impact in the world she had left behind too soon. The first officers to arrive at the Mitchell home on that March afternoon were patrol officers Melissa Jenkins and Thomas Rivera, who secured the scene and immediately called for additional resources upon discovering the three victims. Detective Ryan Cooper, a 15-year veteran of the Charleston Police Department's Homicide Division, was assigned as lead investigator and arrived at the scene within 30 minutes of the initial call. Cooper, known for his methodical approach and calm demeanor in even the most disturbing crime scenes, would later say that the Mitchell family murders affected him more deeply than any case in his career. The contrast between the cheerful family home, with its refrigerator covered in children's artwork and toys scattered across the floor, and the brutal violence that had occurred there, was jarring even to experienced law enforcement personnel. Crime scene technicians began the painstaking process of documenting and collecting evidence, while Detective Cooper conducted initial interviews with David Mitchell and neighbors who had gathered outside the police perimeter. David, still in shock, provided information about the family's routines, his last communications with Sophia, and the disturbing call he had received from his sister, Ashley. Cooper noted that David appeared genuinely devastated and confused, repeatedly asking why anyone would want to harm his family and expressing disbelief that there could have been an intruder in their normally safe neighborhood. Neighbors confirmed that the Mitchell family was well liked in the community and that they had never observed any unusual visitors or activity at the home prior to that day. The 911 call placed by David Mitchell was immediately reviewed by investigators, who noted his genuine panic and the information he provided about Ashley's call to him reporting an intruder. Detective Cooper dispatched officers to locate Ashley Callison, who was found at her parents' home approximately 20 minutes after the initial discovery of the bodies. When approached by officers, Ashley appeared visibly shaken, but agreed to accompany them to the police station to provide a formal statement about what she had witnessed. Her parents, George and Elizabeth Mitchell, insisted on accompanying their underage daughter and contacted an attorney to meet them at the station, exercising appropriate caution, even though Ashley was initially being treated as a witness rather than a suspect. At the police station, Ashley Callison provided a detailed account of her alleged discovery of the crime scene. According to her statement, she had gone to visit her sister-in-law and nephews that afternoon, as she sometimes did when she had free time after school. She claimed that as she approached the house, she heard what sounded like a loud thump, followed by a man's voice shouting. Feeling uneasy, she said she had hesitated before cautiously entering through the unlocked back door, calling out for Sophia. Upon entering the living room and discovering the bodies, she stated that she had immediately fled the house in terror, afraid that the intruder might still be present, and called her brother from her car after driving a safe distance away. While Ashley was being interviewed, crime scene investigators at the Mitchell home made a discovery that would become the first significant contradiction to her story. The home's security system, while not equipped with cameras, did keep an electronic log of when doors were opened and closed. This log showed that the back door had only been opened twice that afternoon, once at 2:17 p.m., presumably when Ashley arrived, and again at 3:15 p.m., when she apparently left. There was no record of any other entry, casting immediate doubt on her story of an intruder. Additionally, the home showed no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be missing or disturbed beyond the immediate area of the shootings. Perhaps the most crucial piece of evidence discovered early in the investigation was Sophia's phone, which was found on the sofa beside her body. The phone contained the videos she had sent to David at 2:43 p.m., showing the boys playing happily with Ashley, visible briefly in the background. The timestamp on these videos established that the family was alive just 4 minutes before the estimated time of death based on forensic evidence. This timeline made Ashley's story of arriving to find an intruder essentially impossible, as it placed her definitively at the scene when the murders occurred. When confronted with this evidence during a second interview, Ashley claimed she had arrived earlier than she initially stated, but had left briefly to get something from her car, during which time she believed the intruder must have entered. The murder weapon, a 9mm handgun registered to David Mitchell, was recovered from the coffee table in the living room with Ashley's fingerprints on both the gun and the ammunition. While Ashley initially claimed she had never touched the weapon, she later changed her statement to say she had picked it up from the floor after finding the bodies, thinking the intruder might still be in the house. However, gunshot residue tests performed on Ashley's hands and clothing strongly suggested she had fired a weapon recently, contradicting her claim of merely finding the gun. The gun safe in the master bedroom, where David kept the weapon locked, had been opened using the correct combination, a combination that David confirmed he had never shared with his sister. Another critical piece of evidence emerged when detectives reviewed Ashley's cell phone records, which showed her location throughout the afternoon of the murders. The data contradicted several aspects of her story, particularly her claim that she had fled the house immediately upon discovering the bodies and called her brother from her car. Cell tower pings indicated that her phone had remained at the Mitchell home until approximately 3:15 p.m., nearly 30 minutes after the estimated time of the murders, before moving to a location several blocks away where she placed the call to David at 3:17 p.m. This suggested that, rather than fleeing immediately in panic as she had claimed, Ashley had remained in the house for a significant period after the shootings. As investigators continued to process the scene, they discovered partial bloody footprints leading from the living room to the master bedroom and back. The size and pattern matched Ashley's shoes, which had traces of blood on the soles when they were seized as evidence. When questioned about these footprints, Ashley claimed she must have stepped in blood when she entered the room and discovered the bodies. But the pattern of movement suggested someone had walked to the bedroom after the shootings occurred, not someone who had fled immediately upon discovering the crime scene. In the master bedroom, detectives found the open gun safe and signs that someone had searched through several drawers, though nothing appeared to be missing. The autopsy reports provided by the Charleston County Medical Examiner's Office confirmed that all 3 victims had died from single gunshot wounds to the head, fired at close range. Sophia and Liam had been shot from behind, while Noah appeared to have been facing his killer when he was shot. The medical examiner determined that the deaths had occurred almost simultaneously, between 2:45 and 2:50 p.m., based on body temperature and other physiological indicators. This timeline aligned perfectly with the last video Sophia had sent to David at 2:43 p.m., and further contradicted Ashley's evolving story about discovering the bodies after an intruder had fled. By the end of the first 48 hours of investigation, Detective Cooper had compiled enough evidence to consider Ashley Callison the prime suspect in the triple homicide. The contradictions in her story, the physical evidence, placing her at the scene during the time of the murders, the gunshot residue on her hands, and her fingerprints on the murder weapon all pointed to her involvement. What remained elusive was any sense of motive. Why would a 17-year-old girl with no known history of violence suddenly murder her sister-in-law and young nephews? Interviews with family members, teachers, and Ashley's friends revealed no obvious conflicts between Ashley and Sophia, no jealousy or resentment that would explain such an extreme act. David Mitchell, when carefully questioned about his sister's relationship with his wife and children, expressed complete bewilderment at the emerging evidence. He described Ashley as having been a typical teenager, sometimes moody, but generally affectionate toward her nephews and on good terms with Sophia. He did mention that Ashley had been struggling academically in her junior year of high school and had recently broken up with her boyfriend, but nothing that would suggest she was capable of violence. "There must be some mistake," he told Detective Cooper during a follow-up interview. "Ashley loved the boys. She would never hurt them." The pain and confusion in his voice reflected the additional layer of trauma he was experiencing as the evidence increasingly pointed to his own sister as his family's killer. On the 3rd day of the investigation, Detective Cooper called a meeting with the Charleston County Prosecutor's Office to present the evidence gathered against Ashley Callison. The inconsistencies in Ashley's story had become impossible to ignore, and the physical evidence strongly suggested she was responsible for the murders of Sophia, Liam, and Noah Mitchell. Present at this meeting was Assistant District Attorney Grace Taylor, an experienced prosecutor known for her careful approach to building cases, particularly those involving juvenile offenders. After reviewing the evidence, Taylor agreed there was probable cause to charge Ashley Callison with 3 counts of first-degree murder, though she cautioned that understanding the motive would be crucial for successfully prosecuting the case. The decision to charge Ashley as an adult, despite her being 17 at the time of the crimes, was made based on the severity of the offenses and South Carolina law regarding violent crimes committed by juveniles. Prosecutor Taylor understood the complexities of trying a teenager for such serious crimes, but believed the premeditated nature of the murders, evidenced by Ashley accessing the gun safe with the correct combination, justified adult prosecution. The legal team prepared the necessary paperwork, while Detective Cooper and his team continued to gather evidence and interview potential witnesses who might shed light on Ashley's state of mind prior to the killings. The central question that continued to haunt the investigation was, why? What could possibly have motivated a teenage girl to murder her sister-in-law and 2 young nephews in such a calculated manner. Ashley's high school teachers and classmates were interviewed extensively, providing a picture of a student who had recently become more withdrawn and whose academic performance had declined over the previous semester. Her English teacher, Barbara Hoffman, reported that Ashley's writing had taken a darker turn in recent months, with essays focusing on themes of betrayal and identity crisis. There was nothing that explicitly suggested violence, Hoffman told investigators, but looking back, there was a growing disconnect between Ashley and her surroundings that concerned me enough that I had mentioned it to her guidance counselor. The guidance counselor confirmed having met with Ashley twice in the months prior to the murders to discuss her falling grades and increasing absenteeism, but said Ashley had been resistant to discussing any personal problems. Ashley's small circle of friends described a gradual change in her behavior following her breakup with her boyfriend, Jason Turner, approximately 3 months before the murders. According to her closest friend, Melissa Chen, Ashley had become increasingly paranoid after the breakup, sometimes making comments about people talking about her behind her back or judging her. She started canceling plans at the last minute and would go days without responding to texts, Chen told detectives. When I asked if she was okay, she would say she was fine, but that she couldn't trust most people anymore. None of her friends, however, recalled Ashley ever expressing any negative feelings specifically toward Sophia or her nephews, making the targeted nature of the violence all the more baffling. A more troubling picture began to emerge when investigators interviewed Jason Turner, Ashley's ex-boyfriend. Turner described a relationship that had become increasingly volatile in its final weeks, with Ashley exhibiting possessive and occasionally paranoid behavior. He recounted an incident where Ashley had become convinced that his female lab partner was trying to steal him away and had created a fake social media account to monitor their interactions. It was getting weird, Turner admitted. She would show up places where she knew I would be, even after we broke up, but I never thought she was dangerous, just going through a rough time. Turner also mentioned that Ashley had expressed frustration about her brother's perfect life on several occasions, comparing it to her own struggles, though he emphasized he had never heard her threaten anyone. Further investigation into Ashley's online activity revealed concerning search histories on her laptop, which had been seized as part of the investigation. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Ashley had searched for information on untraceable poisons, the effects of various medications when taken in high doses, and whether security systems record when doors are opened. Most disturbingly, just 3 days before the murders, she had searched how to make a murder look like an intruder did it, and do police check search history after someone dies? These searches suggested a level of premeditation that contradicted the image of a spontaneous act by a troubled teen and pointed instead to someone who had been contemplating violence for some time. Ashley's parents, George and Elizabeth Mitchell, were devastated as the evidence against their daughter mounted. They had initially stood firmly by Ashley's side, believing her story about discovering an intruder's crime scene. As investigators presented them with the timeline discrepancies, the search history, and the physical evidence, their certainty gave way to confusion and grief. "We don't understand," Elizabeth told Detective Cooper during a tearful interview. "Ashley has always been a good girl. There must be some explanation." They described their daughter as having been more reserved in recent months, but attributed this to typical teenage mood swings and the stress of junior year. They confirmed that Ashley knew the combination to David's gun safe, as the family had gone target shooting together several times at a local range. David Mitchell's reaction to the mounting evidence against his sister was complex and heart-wrenching. In subsequent interviews, he recalled instances where Ashley had made comments about Sophia having the perfect life or getting everything she wanted. But he had interpreted these as normal expressions of teenage angst rather than dangerous resentment. Ashley was at our wedding. She held both boys when they were born. She helped Sophia plan their birthday parties, he told investigators, his voice breaking. How do you go from that to this? How do I make sense of losing my wife and children at the hands of my own sister? The additional trauma of betrayal by a family member compounded David's already overwhelming grief, leaving him isolated in an impossible position between his murdered family and his apparently guilty sister. On March 18, 2022, 4 days after the murders, Detective Cooper obtained an arrest warrant for Ashley Callison based on the substantial evidence collected. Rather than making a public arrest that might generate media spectacle, Cooper arranged with Ashley's attorney for her to surrender at the Charleston County Juvenile Detention Center, where she would be processed before being transferred to adult custody. Ashley was informed of the charges against her, 3 counts of first-degree murder, and of the prosecution's intention to try her as an adult, despite her age at the time of the crimes. Her attorney, criminal defense lawyer Rebecca Walsh, issued a brief statement asking the public to reserve judgment until all the facts were known, and noting that Ashley maintained her innocence. The arrest of Ashley Callison shocked the Charleston community, particularly among her classmates and teachers at Porter God School, the prestigious private school she had attended since 9th grade. The school administration brought in grief counselors to help students process the disturbing news that one of their peers was accused of murdering her own family members. Many students expressed disbelief, describing Ashley as quiet, but not noticeably troubled. She wasn't super popular, but she wasn't an outcast either, said junior class president Tyler Robinson. She was just normal. Nobody saw this coming. This sentiment was echoed by many who knew Ashley. The apparent normality of her outward behavior made the violence she was accused of all the more disturbing. The days following Ashley's arrest saw a flurry of media attention descend on Charleston, with national news outlets picking up the story of the teenage girl accused of killing her sister-in-law and young nephews without apparent motive. Legal experts appearing on television speculated about possible defenses, with many suggesting that Ashley's attorney would likely pursue a mental health-based strategy given her age and the seemingly motiveless nature of the crimes. Others pointed to the extensive evidence against her and suggested that a plea deal might be the best option to avoid the possibility of life imprisonment. Through it all, the Mitchell family retreated from public view, devastated by losses that extended in multiple directions. Mental health evaluations were ordered by both the defense and prosecution as the legal process moved forward. Ashley underwent extensive psychological testing while in custody, with experts attempting to determine her state of mind at the time of the murders and whether any diagnosable mental illness might have played a role in her actions. The initial evaluations, while not made public, reportedly suggested that Ashley was competent to stand trial and did not meet the legal criteria for insanity. However, they did indicate some concerning personality traits and possible emerging psychological issues that, while not rising to the level of criminal insanity, might help explain the seemingly motiveless violence she had perpetrated against her family members. As Ashley Callison awaited trial in custody, Detective Cooper and his team continued to build their case, meticulously documenting every piece of evidence and ensuring that all procedures had been properly followed to prevent any legal challenges. The gun used in the murders was definitively linked to Ashley through fingerprints, DNA, and gunshot residue. The timeline established by Sophia's final videos, the security system log, and cell phone data created an airtight chronology that placed Ashley at the scene during the narrow window when the murders occurred. What remained elusive, despite all the physical evidence and background investigation, was a clear understanding of why Ashley had committed these acts. What internal or external factors had driven a seemingly ordinary teenager to such extraordinary violence against her own family. In the weeks following Ashley Callison's arrest, prosecutor Grace Taylor assembled a team dedicated to building the strongest possible case against the teenager accused of triple homicide. The team included forensic experts, psychologists, and seasoned investigators who worked to analyze every piece of evidence and anticipate potential defense strategies. Taylor, with 15 years of experience prosecuting violent crimes, recognized the unique challenges presented by this case, particularly the defendant's age and the absence of an obvious motive. Without a clear motive, juries sometimes struggle to accept that the evidence, however compelling, points to guilt, Taylor explained to her team during an early strategy session. Our job is to ensure that the physical evidence is so overwhelming that motive becomes secondary to the question of who committed these crimes. The forensic evidence against Ashley continued to mount as laboratory results confirmed initial findings and new analyses were completed. Ballistics experts confirmed that the 9mm handgun found at the scene was indeed the murder weapon, with Ashley's fingerprints found not only on the exterior of the gun, but also on the magazine and individual bullets, suggesting she had loaded the weapon herself rather than merely handling it after the fact, as she had claimed. Blood spatter analysis revealed minute droplets of blood on Ashley's clothing that had been imperceptible to the naked eye, but were consistent with backspatter from close-range gunshot wounds. These findings directly contradicted Ashley's claim that she had only entered the room after the shootings and had not approached the victims closely. The digital forensics team uncovered additional disturbing evidence from Ashley's online activities in the months leading up to the murders. Beyond the searches already discovered regarding poisoning and staging crime scenes, they found that Ashley had visited several true crime forums where she had read extensively about cases involving family annihilators and killers who had successfully blamed intruders. She had also researched the juvenile justice system in South Carolina, particularly focusing on cases where minors had been tried as adults and the criteria used in making those determinations. This suggested not only premeditation, but a calculated awareness of the potential legal consequences of her actions and possible strategies to minimize them. Ashley's cell phone provided further evidence through her text message, history, and location data. Messages exchanged with friends in the weeks before the murders showed increasing isolation and some concerning statements, including one sent to her ex-boyfriend 2 weeks before the murders that read, "Sometimes I think about how easy it would be to make everything stop, to just end all the noise." When Jason had responded asking if she was feeling suicidal, Ashley had replied, "Not for me, for everyone who makes me feel like I'm nothing." While not an explicit threat, prosecutors viewed these messages as evidence of Ashley's deteriorating mental state and growing resentment toward others, potentially including her sister-in-law, who represented a life Ashley coveted but could not have. The prosecution team worked closely with Detective Cooper to interview additional witnesses who might provide insight into Ashley's state of mind or any potential conflicts with Sophia and the children that had not been previously disclosed. A breakthrough came when investigators spoke with Leslie Harper, a longtime friend of Sophia's, who revealed that approximately 1 month before the murders, Sophia had expressed mild concern about Ashley's behavior during a family dinner. According to Harper, Sophia had mentioned that Ashley seemed unusually interested in David's work schedule and financial affairs, asking questions about his life insurance policy and whether Sophia was the sole beneficiary. Sophia laughed it off at the time, Harper told investigators, but she said it felt odd, like Ashley was almost taking inventory of their lives. This information led detectives to take a closer look at the Mitchell family's financial situation, uncovering the fact that David had a substantial life insurance policy that would have paid out to Sophia in the event of his death, and to their children if both parents were deceased. With no direct children of his own, David had listed his parents as secondary beneficiaries. with Ashley as a tertiary beneficiary who would only inherit if her parents were also deceased. While this did not provide an immediate financial motive for Ashley to kill Sophia and the children specifically, it did suggest that Ashley had been contemplating family finances and inheritance structures, information that would be noted for the prosecution's case development. Prosecutors also examined Ashley's academic and medical records, seeking patterns of behavior or previously undisclosed mental health issues that might help explain her actions. Her grades had indeed declined significantly over the past year, with her GPA dropping from a 3.8 to a 2.3 in a single semester. School counseling records showed that teachers had referred Ashley for support services twice in the months before the murders, citing concerns about her withdrawal from social activities and occasional inappropriate emotional responses, such as laughing during a serious classroom discussion about family trauma. Ashley had attended only one counseling session, during which she had been described as guarded and minimizing by the school psychologist, who had recommended further evaluation that Ashley and her parents had not pursued. Medical records revealed that Ashley had been prescribed antidepressants approximately 6 months before the murders, but had stopped taking them after only 2 months against medical advice. Her parents confirmed they had been unaware she had discontinued the medication, believing she was still taking it daily as prescribed. Toxicology tests performed after Ashley's arrest confirmed the absence of both prescribed and illicit drugs in her system at the time of the murders, eliminating the possibility that medication side effects or drug use had played a role in her actions. This suggested that Ashley had been making clear-headed, deliberate choices both in the lead-up to the murders and during the act itself. As the case against Ashley solidified, Prosecutor Taylor focused on establishing a timeline that would leave no room for reasonable doubt about Ashley's presence and actions on the day of the murders. The security system logs from the Mitchell home showed Ashley entering at 2:17 p.m. and leaving at 3:15 p.m. Sophia's final videos, sent to David at 2:43 p.m., showed both boys alive and playing, with Ashley visible in the background in one clip. Based on forensic evidence, the medical examiner had placed the time of death between 2:45 and 2:50 p.m., just minutes after that final video. Ashley's call to David claiming she had discovered the bodies came at 3:17 p.m., approximately 30 minutes after the murders, and just 2 minutes after she had left the house, according to the security logs. This timeline created an insurmountable problem for Ashley's claim that an intruder had committed the murders. There simply was no window of time in which another person could have entered the home, killed 3 people, and exited without being recorded by the security system or captured in Sophia's videos. Ashley's defense team, recognizing the strength of this evidence, began to shift their strategy away from the intruder claim and toward questions of Ashley's mental state and capacity, suggesting that while she might have been physically responsible for the deaths, her psychological condition at the time should mitigate her culpability. This shift was the first tacit acknowledgement that the physical evidence of Ashley's guilt was essentially irrefutable. The prosecution team also focused on the apparent premeditation involved in the crimes. Ashley had arrived at the house knowing David would be at work all day. She had somehow accessed the combination to his gun safe, retrieved the weapon, and loaded it before confronting Sophia and the children. After the murders, she had remained in the house for approximately 30 minutes, during which time she had apparently attempted to stage aspects of the scene to support her later claim of an intruder. She had then left, driven a short distance away, and called her brother with a fabricated story that she maintained through multiple police interviews before the evidence forced her to modify her account. Each of these steps, prosecutors argued, demonstrated a level of planning and awareness that would make any claims of diminished capacity or temporary insanity difficult to sustain. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence emerged when investigators analyzed Ashley's personal journal, which had been found in her bedroom during the execution of a search warrant at her parents' home. The journal entries from the 3 months preceding the murders revealed a young woman increasingly disconnected from reality and harboring disturbing fantasies. In one entry dated approximately 6 weeks before the murders, Ashley had written, "Watched S with the boys today. Everyone thinks she's so perfect, the perfect mother, the perfect wife. Nobody sees how she stole the life that should have been mine. Sometimes I imagine them all gone, and D realizing I'm the only one who truly understands him." This and similar entries suggested a delusional fixation on her brother and resentment toward Sophia that had not been apparent to those around her. As the prosecution prepared for trial, they remained aware that despite the overwhelming physical evidence and troubling insights into Ashley's psychology, they still lacked what most jurors would consider a rational motive for such extreme violence. Prosecutor Taylor decided to directly address this issue in her case planning. "Sometimes the most terrifying truth is that there is no motive that makes sense to a rational mind," she noted in her trial preparation documents. "Our responsibility is to present the evidence of what happened, even if we cannot fully explain why. The absence of a comprehensible motive does not create reasonable doubt when the physical evidence of guilt is this conclusive." This approach would become central to the state's case against Ashley Callison, acknowledging the seemingly senseless nature of the crimes while demonstrating beyond reasonable doubt that she had committed them. By the time Ashley Callison's case was presented to the grand jury in May 2022, 2 months after the murders, the prosecution had assembled what legal observers described as an airtight case connecting her to the deaths of Sophia, Liam, and Noah Mitchell. The grand jury indicted her on 3 counts of first-degree murder, confirming that the case would proceed to trial. As news of the indictment spread throughout Charleston, the community continued to grapple with the shocking nature of the crimes. For many, the fact that the perpetrator was a teenage girl who had murdered her own family members without a clear motive represented a frightening reminder that sometimes violence cannot be easily explained or prevented, that it can emerge from unexpected sources and leave devastation in its wake that ripples through families and communities for years to come. Ashley Callison was formally arrested on March 18, 2022, 4 days after the murders of Sophia, Liam, and Noah Mitchell. The arrest took place at her parents' home in an upscale Charleston neighborhood where Ashley had been staying under their supervision since the day of the murders. Detective Ryan Cooper and a team of officers arrived at the Mitchell residence at 7:30 a.m., having coordinated with Ashley's attorney, Rebecca Walsh, who had arranged for her client to surrender peacefully. The early morning timing was deliberately chosen to minimize media presence, though news of the impending arrest had already begun to circulate among local reporters who had been closely following the case. George and Elizabeth Mitchell stood ashen-faced in the doorway as officers led their daughter to a waiting police vehicle. Ashley, wearing jeans and a gray sweatshirt, showed little visible emotion as she was handcuffed and placed in the back seat of an unmarked police car. Her mother attempted to embrace her before she was taken away, but Ashley remained stiff and unresponsive to the gesture. Elizabeth Mitchell later told friends that what disturbed her most in that moment was not just watching her daughter being arrested for murder, but the complete absence of emotion on Ashley's face. "Like she was watching something happening to someone else," Elizabeth would say. "Not a tear, not a tremble, nothing." At the Charleston County Detention Center, Ashley was processed according to standard procedures for juvenile offenders being charged as adults. She was photographed, fingerprinted, and changed into a detention center uniform before being escorted to an interview room where Detective Cooper and Assistant District Attorney Grace Taylor waited to conduct a formal post-arrest interrogation. Ashley's attorney, Rebecca Walsh, was present throughout this process, having advised her client of her right to remain silent, but indicating that Ashley wished to make a statement. This decision surprised the prosecution team, who had expected the defense to invoke Ashley's rights and decline questioning. The interrogation room was sparsely furnished with a metal table and 4 chairs, a deliberate design meant to create an environment without distractions. Video cameras in the upper corners of the room recorded the entire session from multiple angles, creating an unimpeachable record of the questioning and Ashley's responses. Detective Cooper began the session by formally advising Ashley of her Miranda rights, which she acknowledged understanding before signing the waiver form presented to her. Throughout this preliminary process, Ashley's demeanor remained calm and detached, her responses clear and measured in a way that seemed incongruous with the gravity of her situation. "Ashley," Detective Cooper began after the formalities were complete, "we've gathered substantial evidence regarding what happened at your brother's home on Monday afternoon. Before we discuss that evidence, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us in your own words what happened there." This open-ended approach was a standard technique, allowing the suspect to commit to a narrative before being confronted with contradictory evidence. Ashley glanced briefly at her attorney, who nodded slightly, before turning back to Cooper with an expression that remained disconcertingly neutral. "I've already told you what happened," she replied. "I went to visit Sophia and the boys, heard something strange, and found them after someone had hurt them. I don't know anything more than that." "Detective." Cooper nodded, maintaining a conversational tone as he pulled several photographs from a folder and placed them on the table. These images showed the security system log from the Mitchell home, with timestamps clearly indicating when doors had been opened and closed. "Ashley, the home security system shows that you entered at 2:17 p.m. and that no one else entered or exited until you left at 3:15 p.m. There was no intruder during that time frame." He placed another document on the table, a transcript of the 911 call David had made after receiving Ashley's call. "You called your brother at 3:17 p.m. telling him you had just discovered the bodies and fled the house. Can you explain these discrepancies?" Ashley stared at the documents for several long moments, her expression unchanged. When she finally spoke, her voice remained steady. "Maybe the security system was malfunctioning, or maybe the intruder knew how to bypass it. I'm telling you what I saw." This response demonstrated a pattern that would continue throughout the interrogation. Ashley acknowledged the evidence presented, but offered alternative explanations that, while technically possible, strained credulity when considered alongside the totality of evidence against her. Walsh, her attorney, remained largely silent during these exchanges, occasionally whispering brief advice to her client, but allowing the questioning to proceed. The most significant moment in the interrogation came when Detective Cooper presented Ashley with still images extracted from the videos Sophia had sent to David at 2:43 p.m., just minutes before the estimated time of death. One of these images clearly showed Ashley in the background of the living room, watching the boys play. "These videos were sent by Sophia at 2:43 p.m., Cooper explained. "The medical examiner has determined that Sophia and the boys died between 2:45 and 2:50 p.m. You were there, Ashley. You were the only other person there." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Ashley's face. Not distress or remorse, but what appeared to be annoyance at being contradicted by irrefutable evidence. After conferring briefly with her attorney, Ashley offered a modified account. "Fine. I was there earlier than I said. I left to get something from my car, and when I came back, that's when I found them." This narrative adjustment was typical of how Ashley responded to each piece of evidence presented, acknowledging only what was impossible to deny while maintaining her innocence through increasingly implausible scenarios. When confronted with the gunshot residue found on her hands and clothing, she claimed she must have picked up the gun after finding it at the scene. When shown the blood spatter analysis indicating she had been present during the shootings, she suggested the analysis must be flawed or that the blood had transferred to her clothing when she checked for pulses. Perhaps the most telling moment of the interrogation came when Detective Cooper asked directly about motive. "Ashley, if, and I'm saying if, you were involved in what happened to Sophia and the boys, can you help us understand why? What was going on between you and your sister-in-law?" For the first time, Ashley's composure showed significant cracks. Her eyes narrowed, and her hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, curled into fists. "There was nothing going on," she replied, her voice taking on a bitter edge that hadn't been present before. "Sophia had everything, the perfect husband, the perfect house, the perfect children. Everyone loved Sophia. Everyone thought she was so special." She stopped abruptly, as if realizing she had revealed more than intended, and quickly added, "But I didn't hurt her. I wouldn't do that." This brief glimpse into Ashley's resentment provided investigators with their first real insight into her possible motive, suggesting a deep-seated jealousy toward her sister-in-law's life and status within the family. However, when Detective Cooper attempted to explore this avenue further, Ashley quickly retreated behind her previous detachment, claiming she had merely been expressing frustration at being suspected of such a terrible crime against family members she cared about. The moment of revealing anger was brief but significant, noted by both Cooper and Taylor as potentially crucial for understanding the psychological underpinnings of the crimes. After approximately 3 hours of questioning, during which Ashley maintained her innocence despite the mounting contradictions in her story, Attorney Walsh finally intervened more assertively. "My client has cooperated extensively and answered your questions to the best of her ability," Walsh stated. "If you have more questions, we can continue this at another time, but I believe Ashley needs to rest now." Detective Cooper agreed to conclude the interrogation, having obtained valuable information both from what Ashley had said and, perhaps more tellingly, from her emotional responses, or lack thereof, to specific topics and evidence. As Ashley was escorted to a holding cell to await her initial court appearance, Detective Cooper and Prosecutor Taylor remained in the interrogation room to discuss the session. "Her affect is concerning," Taylor noted. "The emotional disconnect when discussing the victims, especially the children, it's not typical even for guilty suspects." Cooper agreed, adding that, in his experience, even perpetrators of violent crimes typically showed some emotional reaction when confronted with evidence of their actions, whether genuine remorse or defensive anger. "She talked about those boys, her nephews, like they were objects," he observed. "No emotion when describing finding their bodies, no sadness when seeing their photos. It's like she doesn't register what was actually lost." The following day, Ashley Callison appeared in Charleston County Circuit Court for her arraignment, where she was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom was packed with media representatives and community members, many of whom had followed the case closely through local news coverage. David Mitchell was noticeably absent from the proceedings, having chosen to distance himself from his sister's legal process while focusing on his own grief and recovery. Ashley's parents sat in the front row, visibly distressed as their daughter was led into the courtroom in shackles and a detention center uniform. Judge Marilyn Reynolds presided over the arraignment, reading the charges against Ashley Callison in a solemn voice that resonated throughout the hushed courtroom. "How does the defendant plead?" the judge asked after completing the formal reading of charges. Rebecca Walsh stood beside her client as Ashley responded clearly, "Not guilty, Your Honor." This plea, while expected as a standard legal strategy, sent murmurs through the courtroom, particularly among those who had followed the case closely enough to be aware of the substantial evidence against her. Judge Reynolds ordered Ashley to be held without bail pending trial, citing both the severity of the charges and the potential flight risk given the possible penalties she faced if convicted. In the days following the arraignment, the case continued to generate significant media attention, with national news programs sending correspondents to Charleston to cover what many were calling a baffling family tragedy. Much of the coverage focused on the apparent lack of motive and the disturbing fact that the perpetrator was a teenage girl who had killed not only her sister-in-law, but also two young children to whom she was related. Criminal psychologists appeared on various programs, offering theories ranging from undiagnosed mental illness to pathological jealousy to a sociopathic personality disorder that had gone unrecognized by those around her. As Ashley awaited trial in juvenile detention, the prosecution team continued to build their case, focusing particularly on finding evidence that might illuminate her motives more clearly. Additional searches of her bedroom at her parents' home uncovered a hidden collection of photographs of her brother David, dozens of images that had been cut out of family photos, removing Sophia and the children. This discovery suggested an unhealthy fixation on her brother that went beyond normal sibling affection, potentially pointing to a delusional belief system that had fueled her actions against Sophia and the children, whom she might have viewed as obstacles between herself and David. Meanwhile, Ashley underwent comprehensive psychological evaluations ordered by the court to determine both her competency to stand trial and her mental state at the time of the murders. These evaluations involved extensive interviews, personality assessments, and neuropsychological testing conducted by experts selected by both the prosecution and defense. The full results of these evaluations would not be made public until the trial, but preliminary findings leaked to the media suggested that while Ashley had been found competent to stand trial, there were significant concerns about her psychological state, including possible personality disorders characterized by a lack of empathy and difficulty forming normal emotional attachments. As the case moved toward trial, the Charleston community continued to grapple with the senseless tragedy that had claimed the lives of Sophia, Liam, and Noah Mitchell. Memorial services were held, charity funds were established in their names, and public discussions about mental health resources for teenagers gained new urgency. For David Mitchell, the painful process of rebuilding his life continued in private, away from the media attention surrounding his sister's case. Friends reported that he had taken an extended leave from work and was considering moving away from Charleston once the trial was complete, seeking a fresh start in a place where he wasn't known as the man whose sister had murdered his family. The devastating ripple effects of Ashley's actions continued to spread outward, affecting countless lives beyond those she had directly taken. On January 9, 2023, nearly 10 months after the murders of Sophia, Liam, and Noah Mitchell, the trial of Ashley Callison began in the Charleston County Courthouse. The intervening months had been filled with legal motions, psychological evaluations, evidence hearings, and jury selection, all leading to this moment when the facts of the case would finally be presented in open court. The historic courtroom, with its high ceilings, wood paneling, and imposing bench, was filled to capacity with media representatives, legal observers, and members of the community who had obtained the limited public seating through a lottery system. The high-profile nature of the case had drawn national attention, with several major networks broadcasting the proceedings. Judge Marilyn Reynolds entered the courtroom precisely at 9 p.m., her black robes sweeping behind her as she took her seat at the bench. A respected jurist with over 20 years on the bench, Reynolds was known for running a tight courtroom where proceedings moved efficiently and all parties were held to the highest standards of professional conduct. After calling the court to order, she addressed the jury directly, reminding them of their solemn responsibility to consider only the evidence presented in court and to set aside any preconceptions they might have formed from media coverage of the case. "You are the finders of fact in this matter," she instructed them. The lives of both the victims and the defendant depend on your careful attention to the evidence and the law, as I will instruct you. The prosecution team was led by Assistant District Attorney Grace Taylor, who had been preparing for this case since the day of Ashley's arrest. Taylor, a petite woman with prematurely gray hair and penetrating blue eyes, had earned a reputation for her methodical approach and ability to present complex evidence in a way that juries could easily understand. Seated beside her were two additional prosecutors and a case manager who would assist throughout the trial. At the defense table sat Rebecca Walsh, Ashley's lead attorney, flanked by her co-counsel and a paralegal. Walsh, a former public defender who had established a successful private practice specializing in complex criminal defense, was known for her fierce advocacy and strategic approach to difficult cases. Between them sat Ashley Callison, now 18 years old, and notably changed from the teenager who had been arrested 10 months earlier. Her previously long hair had been cut into a severe bob, and she had lost weight during her time in detention, giving her face a more angular appearance. She wore a conservative navy blue dress and minimal makeup, a deliberate styling choice by her defense team to present her as a serious young woman rather than a carefree teenager. Throughout the opening proceedings, Ashley sat perfectly still, her expression neutral as she gazed straight ahead, rarely making eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. After the completion of preliminary matters, Judge Reynolds turned to the prosecution. "Ms. Taylor, you may present your opening statement." Grace Taylor rose from her seat, buttoned her blazer, and walked deliberately to the podium facing the jury. She took a moment to make eye contact with each juror before beginning to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and measured. "This case is about the brutal murder of three innocent people, 32-year-old Sophia Mitchell and her two young sons, 5-year-old Liam and 3-year-old Noah. On the afternoon of March 14, 2022, these three individuals were shot, execution-style, in their own home, a place where they should have been safe, surrounded by love and family. Instead, that home became the site of an unthinkable tragedy." Taylor paused, allowing the gravity of her words to sink in before continuing. "What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the deaths of a mother and her two young children, but the identity of the person who took their lives. The evidence will show beyond any reasonable doubt that Ashley Callison, sister-in-law to Sophia and aunt to those two little boys, pulled the trigger of the gun that killed them." Taylor gestured toward Ashley, who remained impassive. "The evidence will further show that after committing these murders, the defendant methodically attempted to create a false narrative about an intruder, calling her brother with a fabricated story about finding the bodies after hearing a disturbance." Taylor then outlined the prosecution's case, explaining how they would present evidence establishing Ashley's presence at the scene during the exact time frame of the murders, the physical evidence connecting her to the murder weapon, and the numerous contradictions in her story that emerged during the investigation. "What you will not hear during this trial," Taylor continued, her tone shifting slightly, "is a rational explanation for why Ashley Callison killed her sister-in-law and two young nephews. The motive behind these killings remains, in many ways, as disturbing as the acts themselves. The evidence will suggest a young woman consumed by jealousy, resentment, and a disturbing detachment from the value of human life, including the lives of children to whom she was related by blood." Taylor concluded her opening statement by addressing the jury directly, her voice taking on an emotional quality that contrasted with her previous clinical tone. "Sophia Mitchell will never see her sons grow up. Liam and Noah Mitchell will never go to high school, never fall in love, never have the chance to live the lives that stretched before them with such promise. They were robbed of these opportunities in an act of violence that was as senseless as it was brutal. The prosecution asks that you listen carefully to the evidence, follow the trail that leads inexorably to the defendant's guilt and return a verdict that brings justice for Sophia, Liam, and Noah Mitchell. As Taylor returned to her seat, the courtroom remained silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Judge Reynolds then turned to the defense table. "Ms. Walsh, you may present your opening statement." Rebecca Walsh approached the podium with a different energy than Taylor, less prosecutorial certainty and more measured consideration. She adjusted her glasses and addressed the jury in a conversational tone that suggested she was taking them into her confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, there is no question that what happened to Sophia Mitchell and her children was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. No one in this courtroom, least of all Ashley Callison, disputes the heartbreaking nature of these losses." Walsh paused, her expression somber, before continuing. "But tragedy is not the same as murder, and presence at a crime scene does not automatically equate to guilt. The prosecution has just outlined a case built largely on circumstantial evidence and questionable interpretations of Ashley's behavior and statements. What Ms. Taylor did not mention is the complete absence of any eyewitness to the actual shootings, the lack of any history of violence in Ashley's past, and the significant psychological factors that must be considered when evaluating the evidence in this case. The defense attorney then outlined her alternative narrative, suggesting that while Ashley had indeed been present at the Mitchell home, the prosecution could not definitively prove she had pulled the trigger. Walsh carefully avoided directly accusing anyone else, but hinted at unexplored possibilities and alternative scenarios that investigators had allegedly failed to pursue adequately. She also emphasized Ashley's young age, at the time of the murders, 17, legally still a minor, and suggested that the prosecution was attempting to portray normal teenage behaviors like mood swings and social withdrawal as sinister indicators of murderous intent. Throughout this trial, Walsh concluded, "We ask that you remember the presumption of innocence that is the cornerstone of our justice system. Ashley Callison sits before you not as a convicted murderer, but as a citizen accused of crimes that must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. We believe that when you have heard all the evidence, not just the selective narrative presented by the prosecution, you will find that reasonable doubt exists in abundance in this case." With this, Walsh returned to the defense table, placing a reassuring hand briefly on Ashley's shoulder, though the defendant remained as impassive as she had been throughout the proceedings. Judge Reynolds then addressed the prosecution. "Ms. Taylor, you may call your first witness." Taylor stood and responded confidently. "The state calls Detective Ryan Cooper, Charleston Police Department." Cooper entered from a side door and was sworn in before taking his place at the witness stand. A veteran officer with a calm, authoritative presence, Cooper made an effective first witness as he described responding to the crime scene and the initial stages of the investigation. Using photographs and diagrams presented on large screens visible to the jury, he walked through the layout of the Mitchell home and the positions of the victims when they were discovered. "Detective Cooper," Taylor asked, "what was your initial assessment upon entering the Mitchell residence and observing the scene?" Cooper's response was measured but impactful. "It was immediately clear that we were dealing with multiple homicides, not a random act of violence or a burglary gone wrong. The precision of the gunshot wounds, the lack of any signs of struggle, and the absence of forced entry all suggested that the victims knew their killer and likely never suspected they were in danger until the moment the gun was fired." This assessment established early for the jury the intimate and calculated nature of the crimes, qualities that would become central to the prosecution's case against Ashley Callison. The prosecution spent the remainder of the first day establishing the timeline of events through Cooper's testimony and the introduction of key physical evidence. Particular attention was paid to the videos Sophia had sent to David at 2:43 p.m., just minutes before the estimated time of death. These videos, played for the jury, showed a normal, happy family scene: Liam building with blocks, Noah prancing around in his Captain America costume, and Sophia's voice audible in the background saying affectionately, "Show Daddy your tower, Liam." The jurors watched in somber silence, several visibly affected by seeing and hearing the victims so alive and unaware of what would happen to them just minutes later. The most powerful moment came when Taylor introduced the security system logs that recorded Ashley entering the house at 2:17 p.m. and leaving at 3:15 p.m., with no other entries or exits during that time frame. This evidence directly contradicted Ashley's initial claim about an intruder and established that she had been the only other person in the house when the murders occurred. During cross-examination, Walsh attempted to suggest that the security system could have malfunctioned or been bypassed, but Cooper's confident testimony about the system's reliability and the absence of any evidence of tampering effectively neutralized these arguments. The first day of trial concluded with the jury having received a comprehensive overview of the crime scene and timeline. As court was adjourned, observers noted that Ashley Callison had remained almost eerily composed throughout the proceedings, even during the playing of the videos showing her nephews alive and playing just before their deaths. This apparent emotional detachment, which had been noted by investigators from the beginning, continued to be a disturbing aspect of her demeanor that did not escape the jury's attention. As Ashley was led from the courtroom back to detention, the weight of the prosecution's opening salvo hung in the air, setting the stage for the detailed presentation of forensic evidence that would follow in the days ahead. The trial of Ashley Callison entered its second week with the prosecution shifting focus to forensic evidence and expert testimony that would directly link the defendant to the murders of Sophia, Liam, and Noah Mitchell. The courtroom had settled into a somber routine, with many of the same observers returning day after day to follow the proceedings. Media interest remained high, with legal analysts offering nightly summaries of the day's testimony and speculating about the defense's strategy as the prosecution's case appeared increasingly strong. Through it all, Ashley Callison maintained her composed demeanor, occasionally conferring quietly with her attorney, but showing remarkably little reaction to even the most damning testimony. Day 6 of the trial began with the testimony of Dr. Eleanor Patel, the chief medical examiner for Charleston County, who had performed the autopsies on all 3 victims. Dr. Patel, a diminutive woman with steel-gray hair and decades of experience, spoke with clinical precision about her findings. Using anatomical diagrams rather than actual autopsy photographs out of respect for the victim's dignity and the family members present, she explained the nature of the gunshot wounds that had caused each death. All 3 victims died from single gunshot wounds to the head, she testified, her voice steady but compassionate. In each case, the cause of death was catastrophic brain injury resulting from the bullet's path through the cranium and brain tissue. Prosecutor Grace Taylor guided Dr. Patel through the specific details of each victim's injuries. Based on your examination, could you determine the approximate sequence of the shootings? Taylor asked. Dr. Patel nodded, referring to her notes before responding. The evidence suggests that Sophia Mitchell was shot first, while seated on the sofa. The bullet entered the back of her head, indicating she was facing away from the shooter and likely unaware of the threat. Liam Mitchell appears to have been shot next, based on blood spatter patterns and his position in the room. The evidence suggests he was moving, perhaps attempting to run, when he was shot from behind. Noah Mitchell was the final victim, shot while in a crouched position behind an armchair facing the shooter. This testimony painted a harrowing picture for the jury of a methodical progression of violence. First the mother, then the older child, and finally the youngest, little Noah in his Captain America costume, facing his killer in his final moments. Dr. Patel further testified that the positioning of the victims and the bullet trajectories were consistent with a shooter of Ashley's height and build, standing in the positions established by crime scene analysis. During cross-examination, defense attorney Rebecca Walsh attempted to introduce alternative scenarios, but Dr. Patel firmly maintained that the physical evidence supported the prosecution's sequence of events. Following Dr. Patel's testimony, the prosecution called firearms expert James Hernandez, who had analyzed the murder weapon and conducted the gunshot residue tests on Ashley's clothing and hands. Hernandez explained to the jury that the 9mm handgun recovered from the scene had Ashley's fingerprints not just on the exterior surfaces, which might be expected if she had merely picked it up after discovering it, but also on the magazine and individual bullets. These fingerprint patterns are consistent with someone who loaded the weapon, Hernandez testified, not someone who simply handled it briefly after the fact. Hernandez then addressed the gunshot residue findings, explaining in accessible terms how particles are expelled when a firearm is discharged and how they can be transferred to the shooter's hands, face, and clothing. The defendant had significant GSR on both hands, the right sleeve of her sweater, and even traces on her face, he testified. This pattern is consistent with someone who discharged a firearm multiple times at close range, not someone who briefly handled a gun after the fact. Additionally, the concentration and distribution pattern of these particles is inconsistent with secondary transfer that might occur from touching a surface where GSR was present. This testimony was particularly damaging to Ashley's initial claim that she had found the gun at the scene, and perhaps picked it up after the murders had already occurred. Walsh's cross-examination focused on theoretical possibilities for alternative explanations, but each suggestion was met with Hernandez's firm explanation of why the physical evidence contradicted such scenarios. Could someone have planted her fingerprints on the magazine and bullets? Walsh asked, a question that drew an immediate objection from the prosecution for lack of foundation. After a brief sidebar, the judge allowed Hernandez to answer. Based on the pattern and quality of these prints, that would be virtually impossible, he responded. They show natural variation in pressure and positioning that cannot be replicated in a planted fingerprint scenario. The prosecution then called digital forensics expert Dr. Marcus Wong, who had analyzed Ashley's phone, computer, and online activities in the months leading up to the murders. Dr. Wong's testimony provided the jury with insight into Ashley's state of mind and potentially her motives, showing a progression of concerning searches and interests that culminated in the week before the murders. Using carefully prepared slides, he showed how Ashley's search history included topics such as untraceable poisons, how to make a murder look like an intruder, and do police check search history after someone dies. In the 3 months prior to the murders, Dr. Wong testified, the defendant's online activities showed an increasing preoccupation with true crime cases, particularly those involving family annihilators and murders disguised as home invasions. She visited forums where such cases were discussed in detail and seemed particularly interested in cases where the perpetrator initially escaped detection. This testimony established not just premeditation, but a calculated study of methods and potential covers for the crimes Ashley would eventually commit, directly contradicting the defense's suggestion that if Ashley was involved, it would have been a spontaneous act driven by mental health issues. Perhaps the most compelling digital evidence came from Ashley's phone records, which Dr. Wong presented in a clear timeline format. The defendant's cell phone remained at the Mitchell residence from 2:17 p.m. until approximately 3:15 p.m. based on cell tower data, he explained. At 3:17 p.m., The phone was located approximately 3 blocks away from the Mitchell home when she placed the call to her brother, claiming to have just discovered the bodies after an intruder had fled. This evidence directly contradicted Ashley's initial statement and supported the prosecution's contention that she had remained in the house for approximately 30 minutes after the murders, potentially staging aspects of the scene before leaving and fabricating the story about an intruder. The prosecution also introduced text messages and social media posts from Ashley in the months leading up to the murders, showing a young woman increasingly isolated and harboring resentment toward her sister-in-law. In one text to a friend 3 weeks before the murders, Ashley had written, "Went to another perfect family dinner at David," and "Sophia's house. She's so fake with her perfect mom routine and everyone just eats it up. Sometimes I think they'd all be better off without her controlling everything." While not an explicit threat, messages like these established Ashley's negative feelings toward Sophia and contradicted her initial claims to investigators that she had a warm, loving relationship with her sister-in-law and nephews. On day 8 of the trial, the prosecution shifted focus to expert psychological testimony, calling Dr. Rachel Goldman, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated Ashley after her arrest. Dr. Goldman's testimony was carefully limited by pre-trial rulings to observations about Ashley's behavior and psychological patterns without directly diagnosing her or speculating about her state of mind at the time of the crimes, areas that would be addressed by the defense's experts. During my evaluation sessions with Ms. Callison, Dr. Goldman testified, I observed a consistent pattern of emotional detachment when discussing the victims, particularly the children. When asked about her nephews, she spoke about them in abstract terms, with no expression of grief or loss despite having allegedly been close to them. Dr. Goldman went on to explain how this emotional detachment continued when Ashley was shown photographs of the victims alive and family events they had shared. Most individuals, even those who have committed violent acts, typically show some emotional response when confronted with images of victims they knew personally, especially children. Ms. Callison showed no such response, no grief, no remorse, not even the anxiety or defensiveness one might expect from someone falsely accused. This flat affect was consistent across all our sessions and all topics related to the victims. This testimony helped the jury understand why Ashley's behavior after the murders, her composed demeanor during questioning, and now at trial, was not merely the stoicism of an innocent person, but potentially indicative of a disturbing lack of normal human empathy. As the prosecution's case approached its conclusion, they called perhaps their most powerful witness, David Mitchell, Ashley's brother, and the husband and father of the victims. David entered the courtroom with visible reluctance, his face drawn and his movements hesitant. This was his first public appearance related to the case, having declined all media interviews in the months following the murders. As he took the witness stand, his gaze briefly met Ashley's for the first time since her arrest. While David's expression reflected a complex mix of grief and disbelief, Ashley's remained unchanged, a fact not lost on the observers in the courtroom and presumably the jury. David's testimony began with establishing the family relationships and routines, painting a picture of a happy home life suddenly and irrevocably shattered. He spoke in a quiet voice that occasionally broke with emotion, particularly when describing his last moments with Sophia and the boys on the morning of the murders. "I kissed them goodbye like any other day," he testified, pausing to compose himself. "Sophia was planning to make my favorite dinner that night. Liam wanted to show me a new Lego creation when I got home. Noah was already in that Captain America costume he loved so much." The simple domesticity of these details made the violence that followed all the more incomprehensible. Grace Taylor gently guided David through the events of March 14, 2022, from his normal workday to the devastating call from Ashley. Can you tell the court what your sister said when she called you that afternoon? Taylor asked. David took a deep breath before answering. Ashley was talking fast, sounding panicked. She said she'd gone to visit Sophia and the boys, but heard some kind of commotion before she got to the door, a crash, and a man's voice shouting. She said she went in through the back door and found them all in the living room. She said she thought someone had broken in, and that she'd run out and was calling from her car down the street. His voice faltered as he recounted the moment his world began to collapse. David then described his frantic drive home, the police already at the scene, and the gradual, horrific realization that his family was gone. Taylor carefully led him to the most difficult part of his testimony. David, in the months before the murders, did you observe any tension or conflict between your sister Ashley and your wife Sophia? David's response was measured, as if he had given this question considerable thought. Not exactly conflict, no. Ashley and Sophia were cordial, but never particularly close. Ashley sometimes seemed resentful of our family life, making comments about how Sophia had it all or how perfect our life seemed, but it never struck me as something dangerous or concerning, just typical teenage attitude. I never, ever imagined. His voice trailed off, and the courtroom remained respectfully silent as he collected himself. Taylor asked one final question. Did Ashley know the combination to your gun safe? David nodded slowly. Yes, she did. Our family used to go target shooting together occasionally. Ashley had shown interest in learning to shoot when she was about 15, and my father and I had taught her. The combination was my wedding date, something Ashley would have known. This testimony directly connected Ashley to her means of accessing the murder weapon, a key element of the prosecution's case regarding premeditation. During cross-examination, Rebecca Walsh adopted a gentle, almost apologetic tone with David, acknowledging the pain of his position while seeking information that might help her client. Mr. Mitchell, I know this is incredibly difficult, and I'll be as brief as possible, she began. In the months before these tragic events, did you notice any changes in Ashley's behavior or mental state that concerned you? David considered the question before responding. She had become more withdrawn, yes? Our parents mentioned she was struggling in school and she'd broken up with her boyfriend. But these seemed like normal teenage problems, nothing that would suggest this. Walsh nodded sympathetically, choosing not to press further on a line of questioning that clearly wasn't yielding helpful information for the defense. As David was excused from the witness stand, he paused momentarily near the defense table where his sister sat. For a brief moment, the courtroom held its collective breath, wondering if some exchange, a word, a look of recognition, anything, might pass between the siblings whose lives had been so catastrophically altered. But Ashley remained focused forward, showing no acknowledgment of her brother's presence, and David continued past, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his testimony and all it represented. This non-interaction, this absence of even the most basic human connection, seemed to affect the jury more powerfully than any emotional outburst might have done. With David Mitchell's testimony, the prosecution rested its case, having presented a methodical and comprehensive narrative of what had happened on March 14, 2022, and the overwhelming evidence pointing to Ashley Callison as the perpetrator. They had established means, opportunity, and at least the outlines of a motive rooted in jealousy, resentment, and an alarming absence of normal human empathy. As Judge Reynolds adjourned court for the day, legal observers noted that the defense faced a monumental challenge in overcoming the weight of evidence the prosecution had assembled. The focus would now shift to Rebecca Walsh's case for Ashley Callison, a case that would have to provide a compelling alternative explanation for the mountain of physical evidence or convince the jury that Ashley's mental state at the time of the killings warranted consideration beyond the clinical facts presented by the prosecution. After 3 weeks of testimony, including the defense's presentation of psychological experts who attempted to establish that Ashley Callison had been suffering from an undiagnosed mental disorder at the time of the murders. The case was finally ready to go to the jury. The defense had faced an uphill battle throughout, with their psychiatric experts repeatedly forced to concede under cross-examination that even if Ashley did have personality or mood disorders, they would not have prevented her from understanding the nature and wrongfulness of her actions. The prosecution's rebuttal witnesses had been particularly effective in highlighting the calculated nature of Ashley's actions. The accessing of the gun safe, the methodical shootings, and the elaborate cover story about an intruder, all of which suggested a mind functioning with clear intent rather than in the grip of psychosis. On the morning of February 1, 2023, nearly a year after the murders, Judge Marilyn Reynolds delivered her final instructions to the jury. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with court officials having opened an overflow room where additional observers could watch the proceedings on closed-circuit television. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation as Judge Reynolds carefully explained the legal standards for the various possible verdicts, from first-degree murder to lesser-included offenses, and the requirements for finding the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. She emphasized the jury's responsibility to set aside emotion and decide based solely on the evidence presented in court, a particularly challenging instruction given the heartbreaking nature of the case they had heard. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, Ashley Callison remained as composed as she had been throughout the trial, showing no visible anxiety about the decision that would determine the rest of her life. Her parents, George and Elizabeth Mitchell, sat directly behind her in the first row of the gallery, their faces drawn with stress and lack of sleep after weeks of watching their daughter on trial for murdering their grandchildren and daughter-in-law. David Mitchell had not returned to the courtroom since giving his testimony, his absence a poignant reminder of his impossible position, caught between grief for his murdered family and the knowledge that his sister sat accused of taking their lives. Court was adjourned while the jury deliberated, with instructions for all parties to remain within 30 minutes of the courthouse in case a verdict was reached. Legal analysts predicted potentially lengthy deliberations given the complexity of the evidence and the psychological issues raised by the defense. This isn't a straightforward case where jurors are simply deciding whether the defendant committed the act, noted legal commentator Judith Brennan on a local news broadcast. They've heard competing narratives about Ashley Callison's mental state, and while the physical evidence is overwhelming, some jurors may struggle with questions about her capacity and culpability given her age and the psychological testimony. Contrary to these predictions, the jury sent word to the court after just 6 hours of deliberation that they had reached a verdict. The speed with which they had come to their decision sent shockwaves through the legal teams on both sides. The prosecution viewed it as a likely indication that their case had been as compelling to the jury as they believed, while the defense team appeared visibly concerned, knowing that quick verdicts typically favored the prosecution, particularly in cases with such overwhelming physical evidence. As word spread that a verdict had been reached, reporters rushed back to the courthouse, and the courtroom quickly filled beyond capacity once again. At 4:45 p.m., Judge Reynolds called the court back into session. Ashley Callison was led in by court officers, still showing remarkable composure despite the knowledge that the next few minutes would determine her fate. Her parents clutched each other's hands tightly, Elizabeth Mitchell visibly trembling as she watched her daughter take her place at the defense table. Rebecca Walsh placed a supportive hand briefly on Ashley's shoulder, but the young woman gave no response, her gaze fixed forward as it had been throughout the trial. The jury filed in silently, none making eye contact with the defendant or spectators, their expression serious and the weight of their responsibility evident in their demeanor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" Judge Reynolds asked once everyone was seated. The jury foreperson, a middle-aged woman who had been a kindergarten teacher before retirement, stood and responded clearly, "We have, Your Honor." A court officer took the verdict form from her and delivered it to the judge, who reviewed it briefly before handing it back to be read aloud. The courtroom fell completely silent, the tension almost palpable as the foreperson unfolded the paper and prepared to announce the jury's decision. On the first count of murder in the first degree in the death of Sophia Mitchell, we, the jury, find the defendant, Ashley Callison, guilty. The word hung in the air for a moment before the foreperson continued. On the second count of murder in the first degree in the death of Liam Mitchell, we find the defendant guilty. On the third count of murder in the first degree in the death of Noah Mitchell, we find the defendant guilty. With each pronouncement, a collective exhalation seemed to move through the courtroom, the finality of the verdict settling over the proceedings like a heavy shroud. Ashley Callison showed her first significant reaction of the entire trial at the moment the verdicts were read. Her posture, previously so controlled, seemed to collapse slightly, and a momentary expression of disbelief crossed her face before she regained her composure. Behind her, Elizabeth Mitchell let out an anguished sob, burying her face in her husband's shoulder, as the reality that their daughter had been convicted of murdering their grandchildren and daughter-in-law crashed over them. George Mitchell sat stone-faced, one arm around his wife, his other hand covering his eyes as if unable to bear watching the scene unfold before him. Judge Reynolds polled each juror individually, confirming their agreement with the verdicts. Each responded firmly in the affirmative, several with voices that betrayed the emotional weight of their decision. After completing this formality, the judge thanked the jury for their service before addressing the next steps. Sentencing in this matter will be scheduled for March 24, 2023. The defendant will remain in custody until that time. I will hear victim impact statements and any other relevant testimony before imposing sentence. With these words, she adjourned the court, and Ashley Callison was led away by officers, her expression once again neutral, as if the reality of her conviction had not fully registered. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered awaiting news of the verdict. When word spread that Ashley had been found guilty on all counts, a mixed reaction followed. No cheers or celebration, but many expressions of relief that justice had been served for the victims. Several people had brought photos of Sophia, Liam, and Noah, creating an impromptu memorial on the courthouse steps. Among those present was Margaret Thompson, the retired nurse who had stayed with David Mitchell on the day of the murders. When approached by reporters, she spoke briefly, but emotionally. This verdict can't bring them back. Nothing can replace what was lost. But at least there's some accountability now, some acknowledgement of the terrible wrong that was done to that family. Prosecutor Grace Taylor held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps, her approach somber rather than triumphant despite the complete success of her case. Today's verdict represents justice for Sophia, Liam, and Noah Mitchell, whose lives were taken in an act of violence that remains as senseless now as it was the day it occurred. Taylor stated, "While we are satisfied with the jury's decision based on the overwhelming evidence presented, there is no true victory in a case like this, only the affirmation that our justice system can respond appropriately even to the most heartbreaking of crimes." When asked about the apparent lack of motive, Taylor acknowledged that some questions might never be fully answered. Sometimes the why remains elusive, even when the who and how are established beyond doubt. What we do know is that 3 innocent people lost their lives, and today's verdict ensures accountability for those losses. Defense attorney Rebecca Walsh also spoke briefly to the press, expressing disappointment with the verdict while acknowledging the difficult nature of the case. "We respect the jury's decision while disagreeing with their conclusion," Walsh stated. This case presented complex questions about adolescent mental health and development that we believe warranted more consideration than they received. We will be exploring all options for appeal. Walsh declined to discuss specific grounds for potential appeal, but mentioned concerns about certain evidence admissions and the decision to try Ashley as an adult, despite her being 17 at the time of the crimes. The most poignant response came in the form of a written statement from David Mitchell, released through a family spokesperson shortly after the verdict was announced. Today's verdict brings legal closure to the worst chapter of my life, but no court decision can fill the void left by the loss of Sophia, Liam, and Noah, the statement read. They were the center of my world, and their absence is a pain I carry every day. While I am grateful for the careful consideration of the case jury and the diligence of the investigators and prosecutors who worked on this case, there is no satisfaction in seeing my sister convicted. There are no winners today, only varying degrees of loss that will echo through our family for generations. The statement concluded with a request for privacy as he continued to rebuild his life in the aftermath of the tragedy. In the days following the verdict, media analysis of the case centered on two main themes: the apparent lack of a clear motive and the question of whether more could have been done to identify and address Ashley's psychological issues before they culminated in violence. Criminal psychologists offered various theories, with some suggesting that Ashley's actions reflected a rare form of pathological jealousy combined with antisocial personality traits that had gone unrecognized by those around her. Others pointed to the increasingly isolating nature of adolescent life, where concerning behaviors can be misinterpreted as typical teenage moodiness until it's too late. The case became a flashpoint for discussions about mental health resources for teenagers and the challenges of distinguishing between normal adolescent turbulence and dangerous psychological deterioration. For the Charleston community, the conclusion of the trial brought a measure of closure to a tragedy that had shaken their sense of security and challenged their understanding of family relationships. Memorial services were held at various churches throughout the city, and a permanent memorial garden was established at the elementary school Liam had attended, with plans for it to include a playground named in honor of Noah. Community leaders used the occasion to launch a new initiative focused on youth mental health resources, hoping to prevent future tragedies by ensuring troubled teenagers had access to appropriate support services before reaching a crisis point. As the community began the slow process of healing, Ashley Callison returned to detention to await her sentencing hearing. The guilty verdicts on 3 counts of first-degree murder meant she faced a minimum of 30 years to life in prison for each count, with the possibility that the judge would order the sentences to be served consecutively rather than concurrently. At 18 years old, having committed the murders at 17, Ashley faced the prospect of spending the rest of her life behind bars, a stark consequence for actions that, despite weeks of testimony and thousands of pages of evidence, remained in many ways as inexplicable as they were unforgivable. On March 24, 2023, just over a year after the murders of Sophia, Liam, and Noah Mitchell, the community of Charleston once again gathered at the county courthouse for Ashley Callison's sentencing hearing. The courtroom was somber as Judge Marilyn Reynolds took the bench, preparing to determine the punishment for crimes that had shattered a family and shocked a community. Now 19 years old, Ashley Callison appeared thinner than she had at the start of her trial, the year in detention having taken a visible toll, despite her continued emotional detachment. She wore a simple gray dress, her hair pulled back, and sat between her attorneys with the same composed demeanor that had characterized her throughout the proceedings. The sentencing hearing began with victim impact statements, an opportunity for those affected by Ashley's crimes to address the court about the devastating consequences of her actions. The first to speak was Robert Reynolds, Sophia's father, who approached the podium with the careful movements of a man carrying an immense burden. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. "My wife and I raised our daughter to see the good in people. Sophia believed in kindness and family above all else. She welcomed Ashley as a sister, invited her into her home, allowed her to be part of her children's lives." He paused, gathering himself before continuing. "Those children, our grandsons, were the light of our lives. Liam, with his curious mind always asking questions, Noah with his boundless energy, and that Captain America costume he loved so much." Reynolds described how the loss had affected their family. Catherine, Sophia's mother, unable to get out of bed for weeks after the murders, the empty chairs at holiday gatherings, the constant, aching awareness that their daughter and grandsons should be there, but never would be again. When people ask how we're doing, we say we're managing, because what else can you say? But the truth is we're just existing. There's a difference between living and merely continuing to breathe, and we've learned that difference in the cruelest possible way. As he concluded his statement, he turned briefly toward Ashley, perhaps hoping for some sign of remorse or recognition. But she remained impassive, her gaze directed at the table before her, rather than at the man whose family she had decimated. Several other individuals spoke, including Sophia's closest friend, Leslie Harper, who described the void left in so many lives by the loss of Sophia and the boys. Teachers from Liam's school shared memories of a bright, enthusiastic child who would never have the chance to grow into his potential. The most powerful impact statement came from David Mitchell, who approached the podium with visible reluctance, the weight of his position, speaking about the sentencing of his sister for murdering his wife and children, evident in every aspect of his demeanor. The courtroom fell completely silent as he began to speak, his voice barely audible at first, before gaining strength. "I've struggled to find words that could possibly convey what this has done to my life," David began. "Every morning I wake up, and for a split second, before consciousness fully returns, everything is normal. Then reality crashes in, and I remember they're gone. My wife, my boys, my future, all of it gone. In minutes." He spoke without notes, his words clearly coming from the deepest places of his grief. "I'll never hear Liam read a book aloud again. I'll never see Noah grow out of that Captain America phase he was in. I'll never hold Sophia's hand, or hear her laugh, or grow old with her like we planned. And the person who took all of that away, who made the deliberate choice to end their lives, is my own sister." David then addressed the question that had haunted the case from the beginning. Why? "I've tortured myself trying to understand what could have driven Ashley to do this. Was there something I missed? Some sign I should have seen? Some way I could have prevented this?" His voice broke momentarily before he continued, "But the truth is there was no rational reason. Nothing Sophia or the boys did could ever justify what happened to them. This wasn't self-defense. It wasn't a response to any harm they had caused. It was just senseless cruelty against people who had shown Ashley nothing but love and inclusion in our family." As David concluded his statement, he finally looked directly at Ashley for the first time since his testimony during the trial. "I don't know if you're capable of understanding what you've done, not just to Sophia, Liam, and Noah, but to everyone who loved them. To our parents who have lost not just grandchildren and a daughter-in-law, but in many ways a daughter as well. To me, who lost everything that mattered and can never get it back." Ashley finally raised her eyes to meet her brother's, and for the briefest moment, something, perhaps recognition, perhaps simple awareness, flickered across her face before she looked away again. David returned to his seat without another word, the courtroom still processing the raw emotion of his statement. After the victim impact statements were completed, the defense was given an opportunity to present mitigating factors for the court's consideration during sentencing. Rebecca Walsh approached the podium with several reports from psychological experts who had evaluated Ashley, arguing that her young age at the time of the crimes and her psychological issues warranted consideration in determining an appropriate sentence. Your Honor, while the jury has found Ashley Callison guilty of these crimes, we ask the court to consider that she was legally a minor when they occurred, a 17-year-old whose brain was still developing and whose psychological problems went undiagnosed and untreated. Walsh presented evidence from neuropsychological evaluations suggesting that Ashley suffered from a combination of personality disorders characterized by emotional detachment, grandiose thinking, and an inability to empathize normally with others. These conditions did not rise to the level of legal insanity, but they do provide context for understanding how a young person with no prior history of violence could commit such acts, Walsh argued. We believe that with appropriate long-term treatment in a structured environment, Ashley can develop a greater understanding of her actions and potentially be rehabilitated. The defense recommended concurrent sentences with the possibility of parole after the minimum 30 years required by law, citing Ashley's youth and psychological factors as justification for this more lenient approach. Prosecutor Grace Taylor then presented the state's sentencing recommendation, arguing forcefully for consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Your Honor, the premeditated and calculated nature of these crimes, coupled with the defendant's continued lack of remorse or even basic acknowledgement of responsibility, demands the maximum sentence allowed by law, Taylor stated. Ashley Callison did not act in a moment of confusion or crisis. She methodically planned these killings, carried them out with precision, and then created an elaborate cover story in an attempt to escape justice. The fact that she was 17 rather than 18 at the time makes little difference in terms of her understanding of the gravity and wrongfulness of her actions. Taylor reminded the court of the evidence showing Ashley's online searches about murder methods and how to make a killing look like the work of an intruder, her access of the gun safe using a combination she knew, and her deliberate targeting of not just Sophia, but two innocent children, one of whom was only 3 years old. These were not the impulsive actions of a troubled teenager, but the calculated choices of someone who valued her own desires above the lives of others, including children she was related to and had known since their births, Taylor concluded. Justice for Sophia, Liam, and Noah Mitchell requires nothing less than the maximum sentence possible under the law. Finally, Judge Reynolds asked Ashley if she wished to make a statement to the court before sentencing. After a brief consultation with her attorney, Ashley rose slowly to her feet. For the first time since the beginning of the legal proceedings, a hint of emotion showed on her face, not remorse or grief, but something closer to resignation mixed with confusion, as if she herself didn't fully understand the situation she found herself in. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice soft and slightly uncertain. "I know everyone thinks I did these terrible things. The jury said I did. But it doesn't feel real to me. None of it does. It's like everyone's talking about someone else, not me." This statement, rather than expressing contrition or accepting responsibility, seemed to confirm the psychological assessment of Ashley's detachment from the reality and impact of her actions. She continued speaking for several more minutes, but her words focused primarily on her own experience. The difficulty of detention, her confusion about why everyone was so angry with her, her belief that things got out of control, without ever specifying what things she meant or acknowledging her role in the deaths of her sister-in-law and nephews. As she concluded and returned to her seat, the absence of any meaningful expression of remorse or recognition of the harm she had caused was striking, reinforcing for many observers the disturbing psychological disconnect that had been evident throughout the case. After considering all the statements and recommendations, Judge Reynolds delivered her sentencing decision. "Ashley Callison," she began, her tone somber. You have been convicted by a jury of your peers of 3 counts of murder in the first degree, horrible crimes against your own family members, including 2 children who posed no threat to you and deserved nothing but protection from the adults in their lives. The evidence presented at trial established beyond any doubt that these murders were premeditated, calculated, and carried out with a disturbing lack of emotion or remorse that continues to this day. The judge acknowledged the defense's arguments regarding Ashley's age and psychological issues, but ultimately found them insufficient to justify leniency. While I recognize that you were 17 at the time of these crimes, the level of planning and the steps you took afterward to cover your tracks demonstrate a full understanding of the wrongfulness of your actions. The psychological issues identified by the defense experts may help explain your actions, but cannot excuse them, particularly given the deliberate nature of your choices and the devastating consequences they have had for so many people. Judge Reynolds then pronounced sentence. On each count of murder in the first degree, I sentence you to life imprisonment. These sentences are to be served consecutively, not concurrently, for a total of 200 years. You will be eligible for parole consideration after serving a minimum of 30 years for each count, though given the nature of these crimes, such consideration would face significant hurdles. With these words, she effectively ensured that Ashley Callison would spend the remainder of her life in prison, regardless of her young age at the time of sentencing. As the sentence was pronounced, Ashley's parents openly wept, the finality of their daughter's fate seeming to crash over them with new force. Ashley herself showed little reaction beyond a slight widening of her eyes, as if the reality of spending her entire adult life in prison hadn't fully registered. David Mitchell, who had remained expressionless during the judge's remarks, closed his eyes briefly when the sentence was announced. The completion of the legal process, bringing a formal conclusion to the most traumatic chapter of his life, without offering any real resolution to his grief. In the days and weeks following the sentencing, the case of Ashley Callison continued to generate discussion and analysis. Legal experts generally agreed that the sentence, while severe, was appropriate given the nature of the crimes and the evidence of premeditation. Mental health professionals used the case to highlight the challenges of identifying potentially dangerous psychological issues in adolescents before they escalate to violence. Many pointed to Ashley's discontinued antidepressant treatment, her increasingly isolated behavior, and the concerning online searches that had gone unnoticed as missed opportunities for intervention that might have prevented the tragedy. For the Charleston community, the conclusion of the legal proceedings allowed a gradual shift from shock and horror toward memorial and meaning-making. The Sophia Mitchell Foundation, established by David in the months following the murders, expanded its focus beyond educational scholarships to include initiatives promoting early intervention in adolescent mental health issues, attempting to create some positive legacy from an unimaginable tragedy. The foundation partnered with local schools to develop programs helping parents and teachers recognize warning signs of serious psychological disturbance in teenagers and connect them with appropriate resources before crisis points were reached. David Mitchell eventually sold the family home, unable to return to the space where his family had been murdered, and relocated to a different part of Charleston. Friends reported that he found some solace in his work with the foundation and in speaking occasionally to groups about his experience, though the profound loss remained evident in his demeanor and in the careful way he referred to Sophia and the boys, always in the present tense, as if keeping their memory actively alive was a sacred responsibility he had assumed. Sophia is the kind of person who lights up a room, he would say, or Liam loves dinosaurs more than anything, preserving them in an eternal present rather than relegating them to the past. The extended Mitchell and Reynolds families found themselves in the difficult position of mourning not only the victims, but in a different sense, Ashley as well. George and Elizabeth Mitchell continued to visit their daughter in prison, struggling to reconcile their love for her with the horrific acts she had committed. They maintained a relationship with David, though it was inevitably strained by the impossible position they all found themselves in. In a poignant detail that emerged after the trial, it was revealed that Elizabeth had established a small scholarship fund in memory of Liam and Noah at their schools, a gesture of acknowledgement and atonement that David had accepted with quiet gratitude. Ashley Callison began serving her sentence at the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution, South Carolina's maximum security facility for female offenders. Initial reports indicated that she remained largely isolated from other inmates, showing the same emotional detachment that had characterized her throughout the trial. Prison officials noted that she participated minimally in available programs and continued to display limited insight into the impact of her crimes. Mental health professionals in the correctional system worked to develop a treatment plan addressing her personality disorders, though they acknowledged that the prognosis for significant change was guarded, given the entrenched nature of her psychological patterns. As the years passed, the case of Ashley Callison became a reference point in legal and psychological literature, cited in discussions of juvenile offenders, family violence, and the challenges of addressing serious personality disorders before they manifest in harmful behavior. The seemingly motiveless nature of the crimes continued to disturb those who studied the case, representing a particularly troubling category of violence that defies easy explanation or prevention strategies. While most violent crimes can be traced to recognizable motivations like rage, greed, or fear, Ashley's actions remained in the most disturbing category, violence that emerges from a profound disconnection from normal human empathy and attachment, a cold calculation that values the lives of others so little that they can be extinguished without apparent conflict or remorse. For those who had known Sophia, Liam, and Noah Mitchell, the focus gradually shifted from the horror of their deaths to the celebration of their lives. Annual memorial events transformed over time from somber gatherings to celebrations of the joy they had brought to those around them. The memorial garden at Liam's school bloomed each spring with flowers planted by his former classmates, who continued the tradition even as they grew older and moved on to middle and high school. Noah's beloved Captain America costume was preserved in a shadow box that hung in the children's section of the Charleston Public Library, alongside a collection of superhero books donated in his memory. Sophia's impact lived on through the students she had taught and the foundation that bore her name, continuing her commitment to nurturing and supporting children, even after she was no longer there to do so herself. 5 years after the murders, on what would have been Liam's 10th birthday, David Mitchell gave a rare interview in which he reflected on the journey of grief and the process of creating meaning from senseless tragedy. "There are no silver linings to what happened," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Nothing can make the loss of Sophia, Liam, and Noah okay or worthwhile. But I've learned that it's possible to carry both unbearable grief and moments of joy at the same time. I've learned that their lives mattered not just to me, but to this entire community, and that by remembering them and continuing the work Sophia believed in, we keep something of their spirit alive." When asked about his sister, David's response reflected the complex reality of being both a victim of her crimes and her brother. "I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened inside Ashley's mind that day. The experts have their theories, but none of them really answer the fundamental question of how someone can do what she did to people she supposedly cared about. I've had to accept that some things defy explanation, that sometimes there is no why that would ever make sense to those of us who experience love and empathy normally." He paused before adding, "In some ways, Ashley lost everything that day, too: her freedom, her future, her connection to family and community. The difference is, she made that choice. Sophia, Liam, and Noah had no choice at all. This perspective, acknowledging the tragedy from all angles while maintaining the clear distinction between perpetrator and victim, characterized the mature response of a community that had moved beyond the initial shock and horror to a more nuanced understanding of complex human tragedy. The case of Ashley Callison would continue to haunt Charleston for generations, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the incomprehensible potential for violence that can lurk beneath seemingly normal surfaces. But alongside that haunting legacy grew the equally powerful remembrance of 3 lives lived with love and joy, however briefly: Sophia, Liam, and Noah Mitchell, whose story became not just one of how they died, but of who they were and what they meant to all who knew them. In a final poignant detail that emerged during the 5th anniversary memorial service, David shared that he had established a time capsule containing photographs, videos, and mementos of Sophia and the boys, to be opened on what would have been their 25th wedding anniversary. Some might find it strange to plan so far into a future without them, he told those gathered at the service. But I've learned that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes form, becoming memory and legacy and the countless ways they continue to shape who we are and what matters to us. In that sense, they're still here, still part of the story that continues to unfold, not in the way any of us would have chosen, but in the only way now possible. This sentiment, finding ways to carry forward the love and connection with those lost while acknowledging the reality of their absence, became the lasting message that emerged from the tragedy. For a community shaken by senseless violence, it offered a path forward that honored both the pain of what had happened and the possibility of finding meaning and purpose in its aftermath. The story of the Mitchell family murders would always remain, at its core, a devastating example of inexplicable human capacity for harm, but alongside that dark narrative grew a parallel story of resilience, remembrance, and the enduring power of love to transcend even the most unimaginable loss.